All right, jumping right into our deep dive today, we're going to be taking a look at the latest news about Gypsy Rose. A lot of you have been asking to get up to speed, and that's exactly what we are going to do. So we have one source today, a YouTube video by a nurse and true crime enthusiast, and she offers kind of her perspective on everything.
And,
And
and it is important to say that this is just one person's analysis of the situation. So we'll definitely be laying out all the details. But yeah, just kind of keep in mind that this is one person's take.
exactly, we always encourage you to listen and form your own conclusions as well. But let's just jump right into it. So, the big news. Gypsy Rose is a mom. So
Yes.
this announcement came out around January 2nd, 2025. But there's some mystery surrounding the exact birth date.
Yeah, our source speculates that the date that's been given, December 28th, might not be accurate. She even suggests that listeners could check public birth records to find out for sure.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so turning to the medical side of things now. Our source claims that Gypsy Rose had a planned C-section because it was considered a high-risk pregnancy. And this kind of makes sense, right, when you consider her microdeletion.
Yeah, it does. And just to give a little background for anyone who might need a refresher, a microdeletion is a chromosomal disorder where a tiny piece of a chromosome is missing. This can lead to various health problems. And in Gypsy Rose's case, it likely contributed to the decision for a planned C-section.
So could you break down why a C-section would be necessary in a situation like this?
Well, so depending on the specific genes that are affected by the microdeletion, there could be a higher risk of complications during childbirth, things like breathing difficulties for the baby
Hmm.
or developmental delays. So a planned C-section allows the doctors to kind of better manage these risks and ensure a safer delivery, both for the mom and the baby.
That makes sense. Okay, now shifting gears a little bit to the timeline here. Our source points out that if the baby was born on December 28th, then that would place the conception around late March or early April 2024. And here's where it gets a little bit interesting. That time frame overlaps with when Gypsy Rose ended her relationship with Ryan.
Exactly. And that raises some questions about the paternity. Could Ryan be the father and not Gypsy's current husband, Ken?
Right. And to make things even more complicated, Gypsy said that she took Plan B. But our source is skeptical about whether that actually happened.
Yeah, and here it's important to remember that this is speculation on the source's part. It's based on Gypsy's history,
Yeah.
but it definitely adds another layer of intrigue to this story.
Oh, for sure. Our source seems pretty convinced that a paternity test is the only way to know for sure who the father is.
Yeah, she even suggests that Gypsy might be intentionally kind of blurring the timeline here, maybe to keep people guessing or, control the narrative a little bit.
That is an interesting possibility, especially given, Gypsy's history. But, remember, we're only getting one perspective here. So it is important to keep an open mind and, consider all the angles.
Absolutely. Now, let's talk a little bit about the hospital stay, because our source had some interesting observations about that too.
Okay. Yeah, she mentioned something about the number of wristbands, or like tags, she called them, that Gypsy had in the hospital, and how it's got people speculating.
Right, so she addresses that in her video. She explains that as a nurse, she knows that having multiple wristbands is totally standard procedure, especially for, new moms and high-risk pregnancies. Each wristband carries different information that the medical team needs.
So no mystery there, then.
Well, she doesn't completely rule out that there could be something unusual going on, but she does offer a pretty logical explanation based on her own professional experience. It's a good reminder that, not every little detail has to point to a conspiracy.
Yeah, sometimes the simplest explanation is the most likely.
Exactly. Now, getting back to Gypsy's health history for a moment, our source seemed really frustrated by Gypsy's tendency to downplay or even deny her past medical issues.
Yeah, she brought that up quite a bit. It almost felt like she was speaking directly to Gypsy,
Right.
like urging her to acknowledge the reality of her situation.
It is interesting, right? It kind of highlights a pattern we've seen before with Gypsy Rose, this desire to control the narrative, even if it means bending the truth.
Yeah, she even said she denies she's got a complicated health history. Remember that. It's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. And it makes you wonder how this will play out now that she's a mother. Will she be open and honest about any challenges that her child might face? Because of the microdeletion, it's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that past behavior can sometimes offer clues about future actions.
For sure. And speaking of patterns, our source also pointed out something interesting about Gypsy's kind of demeanor throughout all of this.
You mean how she's presented the pregnancy and the birth announcement?
Exactly. She emphasized that Gypsy seemed very aware of when the baby was due, which, reinforces her belief that the C-section was planned in advance.
Yeah, she also explained that doctors typically schedule C-sections about a week before the due date to minimize complications. She gave you the example of like if the due date was December 25th, the C-section would likely happen around December 18th.
Right, so if Gypsy knew the due date and the C-section was planned, why wouldn't she just share that information publicly?
Yeah. Could it be that she's intentionally withholding details to create some drama or to keep people guessing about the timeline?
It's definitely possible. We're talking about someone who has a history of deception, so it wouldn't be surprising if there's more to the story than meets the eye.
Yeah, it seems like every new detail just adds another layer of intrigue. It's definitely keeping us on the edge of our seats.
So as we kind of start to wrap up this first part of our deep dive, what are your final thoughts on the situation so far?
Well, it is a lot to process for sure. We have an uncertain birth date, a high-risk pregnancy with a planned C-section, and of course, this big question about who the baby's father is.
It's been a fascinating deep dive so far. And I think as we wrap things up, it is worth emphasizing that central point that our source keeps coming back to. The timeline just doesn't seem to add up.
Right. If the December 28th birth date is accurate, then conception likely took place while Gypsy was still with Ryan, which makes him a possible candidate for fatherhood, which is, what our source seems so focused on.
Yeah, she's very passionate about getting to the bottom of it. She firmly believes that a paternity test is kind of the key to unraveling this whole mystery.
And she even said that she doesn't believe that Gypsy actually took a Plan B pill, as Gypsy claimed.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement. It really shows how much distrust our source has for Gypsy Rose. She clearly sees her as someone who is very capable of deception.
And, which, considering Gypsy's past, might not be completely unfounded. But it's important for us as listeners to remember that we are only hearing one side of the story.
Exactly. It's up to each of us to weigh the evidence, consider the source's perspective, and ultimately reach our own conclusions. There's no single right answer here.
Absolutely. One of the source's final thoughts was particularly interesting to me. She wondered if Gypsy might have deliberately manipulated the timeline of her pregnancy and the birth announcement.
Now that is a fascinating question. Could this all be a calculated move by Gypsy, just to maintain control and keep everyone guessing? It's definitely something to think about.
It would definitely be in line with some of the patterns that we've seen in her behavior. And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so compelling. It leaves us with more questions than answers.
Exactly. Sometimes the most captivating stories are the ones that don't tie everything up neatly with a bow. They make us think and question and want to explore further.
So what's the biggest takeaway that you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I would say it's this. Approach any story, especially one as complex as this, with a healthy dose of skepticism. Don't just accept information at face value. Dig a little deeper, consider different angles, and remember, there's always more to uncover.
That's great advice. And who knows, maybe as more details emerge, we'll revisit this deep dive and see if our understanding of this already wild story shifts even further. Until then, keep that curiosity alive.
So our source also mentioned something about the number of wristbands Gypsy had in the hospital and how it's got people speculating.
Yeah, those tags, as our source called them.
Right, so she addressed that in her video. She explains that as a nurse, she knows that having multiple wristbands is totally standard procedure, especially for, new moms and high-risk pregnancies. Each wristband carries different information that the medical team needs.
Oh, so no mystery there then.
Well, she doesn't completely rule out that there could be something unusual going on, but she offers a logical explanation based on her own professional experience. It's a good reminder that, not every little detail has to point to a conspiracy.
Right. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the most likely one.
Exactly. Now, getting back to Gypsy's health history for a moment, our source seemed really frustrated by Gypsy's tendency to downplay or even deny her past medical issues.
Yeah, she brought that up a lot. It almost felt like she was speaking directly to Gypsy at some points.
Yeah.
Like urging her to just acknowledge the reality of her situation.
Yeah, it is interesting. It kind of highlights a pattern we've seen before with Gypsy Rose. This desire to control the narrative, even if it means, bending the truth a little bit.
Yeah. She even said she denies she's got a complicated health history. Remember that?
It's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah, it is.
And it kind of makes you wonder how this will play out now that she's a mother. Will she be open and honest about any challenges that her child might face because of the microdeletion? It's something to think about.
Yeah, for sure. It is a good reminder that past behavior can sometimes offer clues about future actions.
Right. Speaking of patterns, our source also pointed out something interesting about Gypsy's kind of demeanor throughout all of this.
You mean how she's presented the pregnancy and the birth announcement?
Exactly. She emphasized that Gypsy seemed very aware of when the baby was due, which, reinforces her belief that the C-section was planned in advance.
Right. Our source also explained that doctors typically schedule C-sections about a week before the due date to minimize complications.
Hmm.
She gave the example that, like, if the due date was December 25th, then the C-section would likely happen around December 18th.
Right, so if Gypsy knew the due date and the C-section was planned, why wouldn't she just share that information publicly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, could it be that she's intentionally withholding details to create a little bit more drama around it all? Or just to keep people guessing about the timeline?
It's possible. We are talking about someone who has a history of deception, so it wouldn't be entirely surprising if there's more to the story than meets the eye at first glance.
Right. It seems like every new detail just adds another layer of intrigue here. It's definitely keeping us on the edge of our seats.
So as we start to wrap up our deep dive, what are your final thoughts on this whole situation?
It's definitely a lot to unpack, that's for sure. We've got this uncertain birth date, the high-risk pregnancy, the planned C-section, and then obviously this big lingering question about the baby's father.
Yeah, a lot of layers to this one. And, I think as we wrap things up, it's worth kind of re-emphasizing that central point our source keeps coming back to. That timeline just doesn't seem to add up.
Right. If that December 28th birth date is really accurate, then conception would have happened while Gypsy was still with Ryan, which, like you said, makes him a possible father, which seems to be what our source is just fixated on.
She really wants to get to the bottom of it. She's convinced that a paternity test is the only way to really know what happened.
And she even went so far as to say that she doesn't believe Gypsy actually took Plan B, like she claimed she did.
It's a pretty strong statement. It really shows you how much distrust she has toward Gypsy Rose. In her mind, Gypsy is definitely someone who is capable of deception.
Which, knowing Gypsy's past, isn't totally out there. But you're right, it's super important for us, listening to this, to remember that this is just one person's take on it.
Absolutely. Everyone listening should weigh the evidence, think about the source's perspective, and come to their own conclusions. It's not about saying one answer is right or wrong. It's about thinking critically.
That's a great point. One of the things that really stuck with me that our source said was she wonders if Gypsy could have messed with the timeline on purpose, like with her pregnancy and the birth announcement.
That's an interesting thought. I mean, is this all a calculated move to keep everyone guessing and keep control of how things look? It's something to consider.
It would definitely fit with some of the things we've seen her do in the past, that's for sure.
Yeah,
And that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. It leaves us with more questions than answers.
exactly. I think sometimes the best stories are the ones that don't wrap everything up perfectly. They make you think and question things and want to keep learning more.
Totally agree. So as we wrap up, what would you say is the biggest takeaway you want people to have from this?
Good question. I think it's this. Approach any story, especially one as complicated as this, with a healthy amount of skepticism. Don't just accept what you hear on the surface. Dig a little, look at different angles, and remember there's always more to be uncovered.
Really good advice. And who knows, maybe as we get more info, we'll revisit this and see if what we thought changes even more. But until then, everyone listening, keep that curiosity going.